InFi, episode 43.
Welcome to InFi, the future of finance, hosted by American economist and author Dr. Robert Murphy. Each week, tune in for dynamic discussions with business pioneers about emerging trends in finance, life insurance, asset management, technology, and more. Now, let's talk the future of finance.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the InFi podcast. Today, I'm going to be speaking with Mark Koyama, who is Associate Professor of Economics at George Mason University. He got his PhD in economics from the University of Oxford, and his work primarily focuses on how historical institutions functioned and the relationship between culture and economic performance. And his work has been published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, one of the top-ranked journals for those who don't know, and the Journal of Economic Literature. What we're talking about, though, today specifically is he, back in March of 2024, had a post called Masters of the Air, the Economics of Bombing in World War II. And so he's just relying on a documentary he's been watching, as well as some book treatments about the aims and results of the Allied, primarily the United States, long-range strategic bombing campaign of World War II, and how the literature has changed in its assessment, that it used to be pretty decisively argued that, or concluded, I should say, that, it didn't really work. The Allies had these plans for what they thought the bombing campaign would achieve, and it didn't work. And that's perhaps not been completely overturned in more recent research, but people are pushing back against that and saying, well, wait a minute, we were framing the problem wrong, and what if you looked at it this way, and so forth. So throughout this, yes, there's a lot of history here. So if you're interested in World War II, you're a World War II buff, I think you'll find this enjoyable. But even if not, the point of this is to show how does economic theory interact with the historical data. And so I think beyond this particular application, you may learn something from this discussion that may have relevance, not just for an assessment of past wars, but also the future of finance. And that's the connection we're going to run with, because this is a really interesting topic for me. Without further ado, here is my discussion with Mark Koyama. Mark, welcome to the InFi podcast.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Bob.
So somebody, I guess it was on Twitter, an economist that I follow, tweeted out a while ago saying, this is a really great article on the economics of warfare. And it's your article, Masters of the Air, the Economics of Bombing in World War II. It came out on March 15th. So before we dive into the particulars, can you just explain, like, is this an area of your research, or is this just something that caught your fancy and you wrote it up?
It's just fun. Though I think it sheds a lot of light on some important economic history questions, which I'm sure we'll get into. So yeah, me and my wife, as we were watching Masters of the Air on Apple TV, we really appreciated its kind of historical authenticity. You know, it doesn't do a lot of things modern TV shows, I feel, sometimes do, try to be too relevant. It seemed authentic to me. So I dived into the book, basically. So it's based on a book. And I had already read a lot about World War II. I'm not like a super nerd when it comes to world wars, like some people are, but I've got a healthy interest in it. And
do you reenact battles in your basement?
Exactly. Well, I paint soldiers, so but not quite reenact. I'm not into the details of every specific tank or airplane. I'm not that bad. Yeah. So the TV show was great, and it raised a lot of economic questions, and I connect them to some reading I'd done and some stuff I teach actually on the economics of World War II.
Okay, great. Yeah. So as I said to you, I think we'll just walk through the article here, because obviously many of the listeners would not have read it yet, just to whet their appetite and have them dive in more. So one thing that jumped out of the beginning, I just want to make sure I understood the claim. You were saying that the losses in the American 8th Air Force were third only to the Japanese kamikazes and German U-boat commanders. Is that, or people serving on a German U-boat?
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, that's true.
And so I would have, I guess that they mean in terms of percentages. Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah. It is a proportion. It was most deadly. I don't have the figures right in front of me. I have it in my head. It's more than 25-30% of people who served who died, but I'd have to double check that. Mm-hmm. It's unbelievably deadly, particularly in the first year of, for a background, right? So World War II obviously begins in 1939, the US enters after Pearl Harbor, end of 1941. But it takes a long time for the Americans to build up a strategic bombing force capable of kind of actually making bombing raids onto continental Germany. So it's actually only 1943, kind of summer 1943, when the Americans are really getting going with this strategic bombing campaign. The British have been doing it already, but the British do night bombing, which means they're basically just hitting random targets. A lot of civilians, they're not really strategic at all. The Americans really believe that they can hit military targets, so they can take out key industrial points. And they said the Americans don't, at this point at least, they are concerned about killing civilians. So they don't want to just carpet bomb the civilian population. They think it's only justified if they can hit strategic targets. So they're going in daylight, basically. And then the other thing, and the TV show is very good at capturing this, is that at this point, this is a big error, really. The Americans had not invested yet in escort fighters, the long-range escort fighters. So they're only escorted by the fighters up until really kind of like the channel or a little bit into the channel. And at a certain point, the fighters have to go home and the bombers are on their own. These bombers, the B-17s or B-29s, are huge. They have a lot of gunners. They're flying fortresses, they're called. So you think they're capable, but obviously they're moving targets for the German fighter planes and the flak anti-aircraft fire. Yeah, so the casualties are very high, especially initially. And that's something the TV show kind of gets, because you see characters who you like and people who are introduced, and then they just get killed off or at least shut down.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess the trade-off would be like, other things equal, I'd rather be in a plane than out in the front lines. But you're saying statistically, you were more likely to go home if you were in some other branch rather than being on these bombers, especially in the beginning when they didn't have the fighter escorts the full way.
Yeah. So it's a weird. So this is like the TV show, the book captures. It's a much better lifestyle apart from the risk of dying, because you basically sleep in a bed at night. You get to like go drinking and partying with civilians. You're not in a cold trench. You're eating decent food. You get fed a big breakfast before you get on one of these planes, but it's very, very dangerous. Your chances of surviving it are much lower than if you're assigned to being an infantry grunt.
Okay. So also the reason it didn't surprise me that there were high losses among the Allied Air Force, but when you said the American, so as you just talked me through it, I guess I did kind of know that, the Americans were the one that more focused on long-range strategic bombing. But I had just thought the Battle of Britain was so awful in terms of, the British just throwing up pilots, just getting mowed down. But you're saying, no, over the course of the war, that was just, a blip compared to how many losses the American pilots suffered.
I think it's a proportion, yeah. I mean, I think the British losses were so heavy in the Air Force, so I think in general, but the overall British Air Force losses are less, I think, because they're bombing at night is the main thing. Yeah. And so similarly, the American Air Force losses against Japan are lower because basically by the time the Americans get into range, the Japanese Air Force has been shot to pieces.
Right.
So they've got a free run more or less. And so basically being one of these guys bombing Germany is particularly dangerous.
Okay. So just, you kind of alluded to it, but just the big picture of what's the function? Why do we call it strategic bombing? What's going on there? And there's sort of this iconic example that a lot of us, I think, especially, so just so you know, Mark, my specialty in economics is capital and interest theory. Yeah. And so when I heard years ago the story of, the Allies were trying to take out ball bearing production facilities, to me, that was amazing. You know what I mean? Just because of the capital, heterogeneity and, you might think, let's take out the German soldier or the snipers, and let's go find the captains. No, if we could take away the Germans' ball bearings, they would cripple. So can you just give the details of that iconic one, but also how, many thought maybe actually that wasn't a huge success?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's a famous raid in 1943 in Ringsburg and Schweinfurt, where there's a ball bearing factory. But I think this is a great segue into the economics of it as well, actually. This is an iconic raid, which is depicted in the TV show as well, in which American losses are very, very high. But at the time, the planners, it's deep in Germany. So Ringsburg is southwest Germany. So you're going really deep into Germany. So that's why the losses incurred are so high. You're not just raiding Hamburg or somewhere close to the coast. And the American planners thought it was worth doing this because of ball bearings are just, they're critical for making any kind of motorized vehicle. So they're seen as this critical input into production. So the idea was if we could take out the ball bearings, we could kind of take out the production of tanks and aircraft and all these other things. And that's going to have this massive knock-on effect on the whole German war economy. So this does connect to kind of capital stuff and capital theory even, I think, because this is my reading of it at least, the Allied planners, they kind of have this view of the economy as a machine.
Mm-hmm.
And so you take out one critical joint, one critical thing, and the whole thing kind of collapses. So that's why they're overly ambitious about what it's going to achieve. They think it's really going to make a massive dent in the German war economy. And I think what economists understand better than kind of war planners is actually that people have a lot of ingenuity, and they're always substitutes. They're always workarounds and substitutes. And you can reconfigure your factory to build something like a ball bearings, I think, potentially. So it turns out this raid is successful in terms of hitting the target. American losses are huge, so we don't try it again, but it doesn't dent the German war economy that much. Like, within 3 months, they've kind of recovered production. So the general kind of historical consensus, most historians say, it's like it wasn't worth it. It was a mistake. Do this kind of strategic damage the way they thought they could. And what I say in my piece actually is that's true. Like this idea, you just take out one factory and that's gonna like destroy production. It was naive, but actually there were loads of benefits to the overall policy of strategic bombing, which actually historians tend to miss. And only you need some kind of actual economic insights to draw out.
Okay, so maybe this is a good point to say, which I think I gleaned from your article, that the consensus as of, for example, 1973 was that their strategic air campaign, the costs were higher than the benefits to the Americans or the Allies. But now, is it that that's been completely flipped, or just that now there's more of a minority report, or can you just give us a sense of that if you're...
So I think that's still the overall consensus. So yeah, after World War II, these things started being assessed and these histories were written up, and the general consensus was that strategic bombing failed relative to the expectations. So backtracking a little bit, the expectations before World War II were kind of twofold. They kind of mixed in. One is that strategic bombing could destroy an economy, and the other one was that basically it would destroy the morale of the civilian population.
Mm-hmm.
This is what the Germans think the Blitz is going to just like terrify the Brits into surrendering, and then the Brits think that bombing like German cities is going to cause people to like hate Hitler and like rise up, or the Japan will surrender because of firebombing red cities. And it really, with the exception of the atom bombs, it doesn't have that morale effect. I mean, strategically,
just on that point for a second, like for people who probably most listeners do know, but I mean, just like the conventional firebombing of Dresden was just horrendous. You know what I mean? Like it wasn't like dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki where this qualitatively different. I mean, I guess it was qualitatively different, but you get the point. It wasn't that was the first large scale civilian loss from bombing from the Allied side. Like there was horrendous losses using just even conventional warheads.
Yeah, exactly. And so the British really kind of, initially they don't want to do this. I'll just a slight detour. So initially the British don't want to do this kind of terror, like you call it terror bombing. And actually, there's a discussion about whether this is a war. By modern standards, I think this would be judged a war crime.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't want to do it. The British too, they're getting the war dropping leaflets. But in response to the German bombing of civilian targets in places like Coventry and in London, they're kind of, the gloves are off. And maybe, do you think they can, basically, they call it dehousing the workers, but it's basically Hamburg, Dresden, they catch fire into these horrible infernos, killing kind of tens of thousands of civilians, men, women, and children. So they're pretty horrific. And the military planners think it's justified because it might cause the war to end earlier than it otherwise would. It's for the argument, like we can end the war by doing this, but it doesn't seem to have, there's a rallying around the flag effect as well. These guys have committed this atrocity. We're going to stick it out, or they're so evil, they're going to do even worse when we surrender. So that is seen as a failure, and I think that's right. Basically, it doesn't achieve the ends the Allies have used to justify it. The strategic bombing of kind of industrial sites, that's also seen as a failure. It's seen as not working. But the question is, what is not working?
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is a revisionist view, which is how fully it's been accepted, I'm not quite sure, but definitely has come to a fore in the last kind of 10, 15 years, which is saying actually it was much more effective than you previously thought. And that's because you have to assess what's the counterfactual, basically. Mm-hmm. And you also have to think about what's the knock-on effect of this bombing on all the other things that are happening in the war. And I guess we'll go into that in the next couple of questions.
Sure. So maybe this is a good spot, you mentioned some point like the economic approach to war, and what does that even mean? And you say it critically involves opportunity cost, which is, a very economistic-y term. Maybe can you explain that? Maybe how, so somebody who isn't thinking in terms of opportunity cost might understate the effectiveness of strategic bombing?
Yeah, exactly. So I think there are two things. One thing I would say before, the opportunity cost is definitely central. So and put quickly, it's like in this bombing context, like the Germans are pulling resources from other theaters to defend against this Allied bombing. And so the opportunity cost for them is that they could be using these fighters to basically destroy Soviet ground formations in the Eastern Front. And so the opportunity cost there is the next best alternative, which is being forgone. But before we get really into that, I think the first thing is that the economic approach really emphasizes attrition, emphasizes kind of guns, manpower, material over and above kind of things like morale or things like the decisive battle. And so that's if you think about a more the economic approach is really exemplified in this book by Philip O'Brien called Why the War Was Won. It's full of numbers and full of tables, and it's just he's counting the number of planes being destroyed, counting the number of tanks.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not a military strategist. People in the actual military might dispute or disagree on or not always hold this position. But the economic approach is to say, in the industrial war, at least, it's these resources, even in pre-industrial war, it's these resources which matter, as opposed to the so-called decisive battles. So the battles are important because that's where resources are being lost. But ultimately, it's that rather than the psychological or strategical tactical kind of battle, which makes all the difference.
Mm-hmm.
And so opportunity cost is critical because when you evaluate the bombing campaign, a naive historian might look at, say, industrial production. And so industrial production doesn't go down in Germany in, say, 1943 into 1944. I think it does start to in late 1944, but it's not going down, it's going up as this bombing campaign is going on. So the naive historian might say, well, production's going up at the same time as American Air Force are bombing these factories. Clearly the bombing's not working. But they're neglecting that the Germans are pulling all these resources from other parts of the war effort to defend against the bombing.
Mm-hmm.
And so actually the air attacks are having a big strategic impact. It's just you're not seeing it necessarily solely in industrial production. You need to evaluate this counterfactual. If the Americans had decided against bombing, the Germans would have had far more airplanes. They would have to put less resources in kind of anti-aircraft guns, of which they're building a huge amount. And they would have been investing in or using these fighter planes, these Messerschmitts. They would have been using them on the Eastern Front, gaining air superiority and potentially holding off or even defeating Russian armies.
Okay, yeah, it's funny how what you're saying dovetails with my son, older teenage son at this point. I play Axis and Allies with him, and I think it's something like he's won 19 games and maybe I won one, and I'm not sure if I'd even won one. And I keep getting better with each loss. I keep learning from my mistakes, and he just keeps staying ahead of me. And at some point, I did ask him, why does this? How come when I did this, it doesn't work, but when you do the same thing, and he was going through and again, it's not worth me trying to remember the exact, but it was an example of what you're talking about here, Mark, where he was like, well, no, because I had you pinned down here, so that meant you couldn't, combine these forces over here, so that's why this happened. But when we flipped roles and I was playing your side, I did, you didn't attack me here. You were holed up over here because you were too defensive, and therefore it freed me up to go, and it was it was like you're saying, it wasn't that tactically I was doing anything stupid, but it was just my big, long-term strategic decisions were not wise compared to his. And so anyway, and also going along with this, I'm probably butchering the quote, but I read somewhere, I think the context was, a lot of Americans, of course, are Civil War buffs. And somebody said something like, the amateur focuses on tactics, the professional focuses on supply lines. That doesn't sound like a sexy thing to worry about. How are we going to make sure, we still have supply lines going back to our production centers to bring up, material. Who care? No, I want to talk about another cavalry does this and we do this charge. But if you get surrounded and, you just run out of food, that's kind of game over.
That's my my impression. I'm not an expert on Civil War, but when I first started reading about it, it's kind of you think, see Robert E. Lee or Jeb Stuart, these heroic figures, or not too heroic, but at least in terms of their battlefield tactics, they're lauded. They were lauded, at least in the past. But then as you understand more about kind of how war really works, then you actually appreciate General Grant he's like the top general of the Civil War, not because he's flashy. He's the opposite of flashy, but because he's the guy who's a master of logistics and kind of attritional stuff.
Okay, so can you, maybe just speak a little bit more? It kind of flows, and you did touch on it, but you had a whole section called "The Myth of the Decisive Battle," and so a lot of people think like, "Oh yeah, Stalingrad, that was it, that was the," and yet you don't think like. So you say here, Stalingrad did not destroy the offensive capabilities of the Wehrmacht. So why is it seen as decisive? Perhaps because of the losses sustained. The 6th Army was all but wiped out, as was the 4th Panzer Army. Total Axis losses were in the 800K to 1 million range. And then you talk about Kiev. We say, but Kiev didn't prove to be decisive because the Soviet Union could replenish its losses. So
yeah,
you want to elaborate on that?
The decisive battle thing is basically it's something. I mean, so people at the time people were claiming. So you want to claim this is a decisive battle because you want to convince your allies and your civilian population the tide has turned. So we're on the way to winning. So ex post, historians or Churchill says El Alamein, which is no one outside Britain and probably not even Britain knows much about El Alamein anymore. Like I think Americans, their history of World War II focus on it, but Churchill calls this the decisive battle actually. And then Stalingrad is seen as the turning point on the Eastern Front. But it's an ex post appellation. It's an ex post naming of it because Hitler has said Kiev was a decisive battle. And no one cares about that anymore because from his perspective at the time, it looked like it was because it was the biggest battle up to that point. And so had the Germans basically replenished their losses from Stalingrad, fought the Soviets to some kind of standstill at Kursk or whatever, and made some kind of compromise peace, let's imagine that was possible, then like Stalingrad wouldn't loom as large. So the argument here is basically it's an ex-post thing. At the time, you don't know if it's a decisive battle. All you know is you lost huge amounts. And the question is, can you replenish them? And the thing I found out in researching for this article was so German manpower losses are bad, and they're really bad at Stalingrad. But up to 1944, they're not worse. They're not as bad as German relative manpower losses in World War One. I guess Germany was able to sustain those. And similarly, there's a lot of young. Basically, every year, another batch of young German men are turning 18, and they're eligible for conscription. So you've got this inflow of people. So long as you can equip them, basically, you can replenish your losses. And so whether or not Stalingrad looks big in absolute numbers, like it's a huge defeat, but it seemed to have been the Germans could have recovered from it if that was the only defeat they had. It's the concurrence of like the Stalingrad, and then they're losing troops in North Africa. There's Kursk 44. I mean, really the decisive thing in my view is, I guess this is not a shocker, but D-Day is really decisive. And so D-Day could have gone badly. It's such an ambitious undertaking by the Allies, particularly the Americans. It's the largest amphibious assault in history. That could have gone wrong. It could have been shot off the beaches, or it could have been bottled up near the beaches in northern France. And Hitler was confident that he didn't make much of a British and American kind of armies. So he thought that Rommel and the commanders, and when Rommel said that commanders in the Wehrmacht and the Western Front would basically bottle them up in Normandy or something like that.
Yeah, you've got at the end of that section called "The Myth of Decisive Battle," you had this long quote that I think is good. So this you say, Cathal Nolan argues in The Allure of Battle that there were no decisive battles in World War II. Stalin was closer to being correct when he noted that, quote, the war will be won by whichever side produces the most motors. And then from this perspective, German military capability was, now this is a quote from Nolan, reduced by local German victories as much as by defeats. That is the nature of materiel war. No one battle or named defeat was decisive. Instead, each great battle accelerated the wearing out of Germany's armed forces and reserves, steepening the arc of attrition until all strategic initiatives shifted to the Allies inside Soviet territory, then in Eastern Europe, at sea and in the air. And so there, again, just to make the point that even a battle where the Germans won in a sense, if they had to give up, the losses to them were more costly in a sense than to the Allies because of the superior total productive capabilities. And so even if the Germans technically won a particular battle, if they lost so many tanks and men and blah, 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 that actually might have hurt the war effort from their point of view.
Yeah, it's precisely it. So yeah, even this is like, a bit of a Pyrrhic victory, right? And it's also relative to your productive capacities as well. So the Soviets can sustain huge losses because their manpower is kind of, relatively speaking, inexhaustible. They've got a large population base to draw on. Very young population. So the Soviet population is huge, but it's also super young. So it's like the shape of your demographic kind of triangle, pyramid matters. And then the other thing, which Phillips O'Brien emphasizes, which has been kind of sometimes de-emphasized, is the extent to which the Americans, first the British, and really the Americans, are really arming the Soviets. So that's like, the Soviets, we bear the brunt of the infantry losses. So like, I'm not, downplaying the contribution of the Soviet peoples to World War II. Like, we lose huge numbers, but they're being equipped by the Americans. So that they have endless trucks, and they can just concentrate their production in things like the T-34 tank because the Americans just giving them other supplies.
Yeah, that was the thesis of Ludwig von Mises. He was a big economist in the Austrian school of economics, and so one could argue he was ideologically predisposed because he was very much a fan of capitalism and an opponent of socialism. But yeah, when he was commenting on World War II, he had served in World War I, but he was too old in World War II. But he said that he thought the only reason the Soviets did so well was because they had the American productive might behind their efforts, and that if it was kind of like that 1-2 punch. Okay, so you also say here now you got conventional wisdom has it that Germany lost World War II on the Eastern Front. Certainly, the bulk of German manpower losses were sustained fighting the Soviet Union. However, a lack of manpower was not the reason Germany lost. So I know you touched on that a little bit, but do you want to just talk about that some more?
Yeah, so this is kind of, I'm taking this argument from Phillips O'Brien. Until D-Day, the German losses are like within, like they're horrendous. Like, hundreds of thousands of people are dying for years. I don't want to, this is, but within, like, given it's a war economy mobilized by the Nazi states, and they're indoctrinating young people, and there's barely any resistance at home. There's people protesting because they'll be arrested and shot. So they can fight this war, absorbing tremendous losses. But after 44, they start to collapse. But let me try and explain why a little bit. I don't think I have it in this piece, but there's a idea in like military strategy called Lancaster's laws. And so there's Lancaster's linear law, which is kind of describing like hand-to-hand combat. So basically, in pre-gunpowder days, two armies fight each other. Like basically, one infantry guy can only kill one other guy at the same time. So it kind of limits the advantage of kind of numerical superiority. But when you get guns, basically it kind of becomes more like a squared law, because the more soldiers you have on the other side, the more guns you have, the more you can kind of concentrate fire, and like several people could be shooting at just one person or two, small number of people. And so basically the advantage of more firepower is magnified. It's not just a 1-for-1 advantage, it's like multiplicative. And so air power is like that. So air power is a force magnifier. So once the Allies get air power, air superiority rather, they have this force magnifier, and they control mobility, and they can pick and choose where to fight the battles. And that's when the odds decisively shift against the Germans. And so that means you have to think about, why do the Germans decisively lose out production of why do they lose their superiority? And that's, they don't produce enough planes, number one. And number two, the planes they do produce are being destroyed on the airfields, really, or they're being destroyed kind of before they're being made even. And similarly, they can't develop good fighter pilots because you need to train your fighter pilots. And so if you're sending guys out into the air and they've never trained before, if they've only got a couple of hours training, they'll be shot down by the experienced Allied fighters. So that's kind of a decisive point of change according to this view.
Okay. Yeah, and just to read some more from your article to buttress what you just said there. So, a lot of this you're drawing from Phillips, Pace, and O'Brien's book, How the War Was Won. He quotes German Army Chief Alfred Jodl, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that name right, who said after the war, this is the German Army chief, not taking into consideration the Russian Air Force, which is of no great importance, I would say in general that in the end, the winning of the complete air superiority in the whole area of the war has altogether decided the war. I would go so far as to say that our power on the land was numerically and from the point of view of armament sufficiently strong, if not to win, at least to hold our own on all fronts, if our Air Force had kept up on the same level. So again, you might argue it's in the interest of the German army chief to say it wasn't our army that was at fault, it was our Air Force, but still. And then you say that there's three main factors here of what O'Brien splits it up into terms of why the air superiority was so decisive: pre-battle destruction, pre-production destruction, and the control of mobility. So you've talked a bit about the control of mobility, but the pre-battle destruction, you say here, if we accept that what ultimately mattered was the destruction of airplanes, tanks, and artillery, then it doesn't matter where they're destroyed. Indeed, it is typically much cheaper to destroy a plane on the ground than in a dogfight. So it's obvious once you say that, but it's actually pretty profound. Can you maybe just elaborate on that?
Yeah, and I think it's a really cool idea. It's also very much it fits sort of like this economic way of viewing the war, I think. So if you're fighting a German Messerschmitt or a fighter plane in the air, like the dogfight, there's a decent chance that you'll be shot down as well, or you'll suffer damage. So if the Americans are taking on every German plane in the air, that's going to lose a lot of planes. And so that's kind of what's going on in the early part of the war. And the German forces, at the beginning of a war, I should say, the Germans and the Japanese have the best trained airmen because they've been fighting for longer, basically. The Allies have had less experience. So it's a very costly way to destroy enemy planes. But if you can destroy them on the ground, it's a huge advantage because they're just like silly ducks. And so actually the Germans take out the Russian Air Force in the beginning of Operation Barbarossa in 1941 because they take it out, they kind of launch a surprise attack and they destroy it while it's on the ground. And that the Russians really lose out as a result of not having an Air Force in the opening months of the war. So if you think about this attritional perspective, what's the most cost-effective way to destroy enemy war equipment or war material? Well, destroy it before you get to a battle. So, Stalingrad, we destroy a lot of planes, a lot of equipment, a lot of tanks, but the Russians pay a lot. They suffer. They lose a lot of Russians and Russian equipment to do that. Whereas the Allies are able to kind of destroy German war equipment more efficiently. And so this is why, again, I see this is also operationalized for political ends as well. People will always say the Russian Soviet contribution to World War II is the decisive one, or it by far is the biggest. We sometimes really, really lay this on thick because the Russians suffered kind of 25 or 22, depending on who you read, 28 million casualties, right? And so that's the measure of their contributions. They contributed the most. But actually, your measure of your contribution is what you're destroying in some sense. And so the Americans and the British were more efficient at destroying German equipment. So they lost far fewer casualties.
So just going along with that, you're saying from 1943 onwards, the Allied bombing campaign began to make its mark on German production numbers. The Regensburg raid, depicted in Masters of the Air, is widely seen as a failure, but O'Brien argues that this assessment should be revised. So now this is a quote from O'Brien. In the end, the 100th suffered more than any other 8th Air Force unit during the Regensburg raid, losing 9 of its 21 B-17s. This was an unsustainable casualty rate. It's one of the reasons that the Anglo-American Strategic Air Offensive in 1943 is almost universally seen as a failure. And yet, for all its heavy losses, this one raid on Regensburg destroyed far more aircraft than the Germans lost during the Battle of Kursk, perhaps more than they lost on the Eastern Front during all of the summer of 43. From the point of view of the ultimate destruction of German power, the strategic air campaign was a necessary failure. And so, of course, if it's necessary, that means it wasn't really a failure.
Yeah, he's saying two things. I think it's very plausible to me. One is that the American loss, from the American perspective, they can see why they're not even seeing all the damage they're doing. We'll get to that later with the pre-production destruction. So, in the fog of war, the Allies expect almost too much of this specific raid. And so they'd say it wasn't worth the losses. And the losses might be unsustainable in the sense that it was difficult morale was falling amongst the 8th Air Force in late 1943, because of too many of them, they were seeing their buddies die, basically. And so it was, given the way the Allies set up, that they are more susceptible to I think, popular opinion, and they need to recruit people. And it's possible that they couldn't continue those losses. So let's take that as a given. Nonetheless, they're doing far more damage than they might have realized to the Germany's actual war capabilities. So it was extremely valuable.
Yeah, and we're getting here. So what you're talking about, the pre-production destruction. So just, again, reading some quotes here. Destroying German aircraft before they took off was obviously more cost-effective than shooting them down once airborne. In non-operational German aircraft, losses soared in 43, but the Allied bombing also reduced the amount of resources available for war production. And then you got a quote from O'Brien saying, it would be conservative to say the total number of German aircraft, mostly fighters, destroyed before production because of factory destruction, relocation, aluminum losses in 1943 was somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000. Somebody estimated between July of 43 and December of 44, the German aircraft production was reduced by 18,492 units because of strategic bombing, So again, in terms of the opportunity cost, and again, a very economistic-y way of looking at things, it's always the counterfactual. Like this is coming up with the argument over minimum wage hike in California. Well, regardless of one's view on that, but I see some defenders just naively looking at, well, no, total restaurant employment went up, and so therefore, and you got to say, okay, but we kind of need to know what would employment have looked like in the absence of this policy change. That's really, the issue. So same thing here. It's not just, did German fighter production go down in absolute terms? It's, would it have been risen much, a much greater amount had it not been for the strategic bombing? And then also you have a chart in there showing how the Luftwaffe, they redeployed their forces, like they had to protect the home front more. And so then, of course, they're not available now to be waging war, on the fronts. And so that's obviously, that wouldn't jump out at you in terms of the observation, the data, but yet clearly that must have had an impact.
Yeah. So, I think it's kind of why, this is a cool topic, I think, for economists, because Payson, Felix O'Brien, I think kind of the economic historian, I'm more of a military guy, but he clearly has this kind of economic framework. And it's quite like Bastiat, the seen and the unseen, right? Mm-hmm. So there's the seen, which is important, but there's all this stuff going on, which is unseen, which we should also really think about to appreciate. And so the pre-production destruction is all the losses, which are all the aircraft which are not being produced because of the factories you're destroying, because of the aluminium loss, or the disruption to the road network, which means you can't move parts around. So that's, all these additional costs. So I think the minimum wage analogy is kind of interesting one, a useful one, because I think to go back to what I was saying earlier, I think the strategic planners of the Allied side, they kind of think the economy is like a machine. A lot of people who are not good economists, they often think the economy is like an engine. It's a car, basically. So you take out one part and it'll collapse. Like it's an engine which is run by the government, run by economic planners. But actually, the more, I guess you could call it hierarchian, but more free market perspective is to say it's a complex organism. Mm-hmm. It's a complex phenomenon. So that's why you can substitute things, and why one thing, you can't just knock out like one thing, like you can knock out the car engine and it will break it. But that's it. Even though it's a complex organism, if you do enough bad stuff to it, you're going to be slowing it down. You're going to be causing it to be less efficient. You're going to be causing it to misallocate resources. And so the cumulative effect of all these bombing raids is actually compounds. It really impacts the ability of the German war economy to kind of produce functional war machines by the end of the war. So the minimum wage analogy, it's another analogy there is sometimes people just look at the effects on employment to assess if the minimum wage is good or bad, right? Did employment go up? And that's a counterfactual question, as you say. But then other people say that they could be adjusting on other margins as well. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, the minimum wage is higher, so maybe I give less kind of non-monetary benefits to the workers. So before, the workers would get a free meal if they worked on shift. Now that's docked from, they have to pay for it, or something like that. Yeah. Right? So you can adjust on other margins as well. And so the Germans are adjusting on all these margins to avoid being bombed, but these margins are adjusting on are really impeding their productive capabilities. So the one I go into, we'll probably go to next, but I can just go there, I guess, is like where they're building the planes. That's like really like a very visual and a very striking example. The Germans are building their planes underground. And you can imagine like how costly and how inefficient that is, because they have to move. Albert Speer is the guy who kind of does this. He's Hitler's architect, and he reorganizes production, often with slave labor. So these are horrendous working conditions. He's putting prisoners of war, Poles, Jews, others to work to build this stuff. But it's not in optimal production facilities. Whereas if you look at where the Americans aren't worried about being bombed, so when they build B-29s, they have these amazingly spacious, vast kind of hangars in the West. where they don't have to worry about any of the constraints the Germans are facing.
Yeah, so we just look at the raw statistics and look at U.S. production was much higher, but as you're pointing out, part of the reason was that yes, the Germans. So the benefit of the strategic bombing wasn't as good as maybe some of the early boosters would have naively said that, if we just do this with it, now the Germans can't make planes anymore. Well, no, they can go underground and do this and that, but that certainly does hamper their efficiency, the number of planes they make per units of the various inputs. And then also you mentioned, bombing the oil fields, that like now German workers have to get redirected to repair the oil fields because you need oil to have a war effort. And so then it's not that knocked them out of the war to hit their oil fields, but it did mean those workers now are not doing something else that they could have been doing because they got to just repair, the oil field. So all those sorts of things. As we wind down here, Mark, let me ask you, and I would be remiss, you've seen that meme that goes around, right, with the bomber and the different, can you just explain, I don't know if you have those details handy. This wasn't directly in your article, but that was from World War II, right? Where that story comes from?
Yeah. I don't know the details specifically. I think it's a B-29, though. I might be wrong. So the bombers which come back, which are being hit by the Germans, have all the bullet holes from the anti-aircraft guns, or I guess the guns from the other planes. All the bullet holes are basically on the tails and on the wings, and they have the core engine area, I think, is relatively unscathed and unhit. And so the naive kind of initial reaction is saying, look, somehow the most vulnerable parts of the plane, the parts which are getting shot at, which we should reinforce with armor, things like the wings or the tail, or the front, that's what we should reinforce. But of course, that's the opposite conclusion they should have drawn. And they did realize that pretty soon, I think, which is that the only ones we see are the planes which are returning, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're shot on your wings or on your tail, you might have some holes in your wings which are impeding your ability to fly, but you're not being knocked out of the sky. Mm-hmm. So hence you return. And so the planes which are being hit in the engine area, they're not returning. So you're never seeing them. And so the actual conclusion you should be drawing is the opposite of the naive one. It's like, no, don't worry about reinforcing the wings or the tail, reinforce the areas which are not being hit on these surviving planes. So I think it's a very good story for appreciating the seen and the unseen and thinking about the logic of these things carefully.
Yeah. And now that's achieved iconic status. It's a meme now at this point on Twitter when someone will make an observation that's committing that same fallacy, and then someone will just, at this point, retweet that person's lame observation or fallacious observation, and then just post a picture of that plane with the bullet holes, and then the people in the know are like, that guy made that same mistake in his reasoning. Okay, well, I think we need to wrap it up at this point. So, Mark, can you point people to, if they like your analysis and your work, where can they go to see more of your?
So I have a Substack, which is on my Twitter handle, but it's also my name, markkoyama.com. I need to update it, but it has plenty of, it's a new Substack. I just started in 2024. It's like combination of historical analyses like this one, which is actually, this was a post I put a lot of effort into, but others are like book reviews or commentaries, and then kind of advertising my own work, talking about some stuff I've been teaching. I'm also on Twitter, but my research can be found on my academic webpage. And so I do a lot of work on early modern and medieval economic history. But I wanted to say one thing, which I was just very briefly on this, which you might be interested in as well, which is another area where I think revisionism of World War II is kind of, might be of interest to people interested in this piece, which is that another standard view is that World War II is really good. So the American economy does amazing things in World War II in terms of producing the weapons of war to win World War II. And I'm someone who I'm very glad they did that. And I think that there's very much more thing to do and so on. But there's this other very standard view people have, which is not only was the American war economy critical to winning World War II, which is true, but they also think World War II was great for the American economy. That's like a standard view, right, that people have. And if you look at the raw GDP numbers, they go up a lot. Like average GDP goes up a lot in World War II. I just wanted to point out that's another area where revisionists, economic historians have pointed out that that's probably not the case.
Yeah,
in some sense.
Okay, yeah. So just so you know, Mark, one of my books for the pop book is The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression and the New Deal. And in there, I do take that on and like, it was World War II spending that ended the Great Depression. And I cite the work of Bob Higgs, among others, to show.
Yeah.
So I'm excited. I know you know this, Mark. I'm explaining to the listeners that, among other problems, when you just look at the naive increase, there were wage and price controls. And the Fed created a bunch of money in World War II. And so they just naively looked at like nominal spending increases. Oh, that's the size of the economy growing. And they didn't factor that. And the denominator wasn't allowed to rise legally. And so therefore it made it look like real GDP was rising when no, there were like lots of shortages and stuff that if prices had been allowed to rise, real GDP growth would not have been as significant, as impressive as it appeared to be on paper. So among other issues.
Yeah, I think it's a great one to end on. Yeah, so Bob Higgs' work is the seminal one, link that out. There's also a really recent book by called Alex Fields, who looks at the productivity. He shows that the productivity gains are also kind of an artifact as well, the data construction. So the idea of like, there's this like amazing learning by doing in these sectors of the economy, that doesn't mean that the productivity of producing peacetime goods was going up. So the legacy of World War II was also probably bad. Like it wasn't good in any direction for the US economy. I think it's something that hasn't filtered through though, I think outside relatively small circles of people into kind of either economic history or Austrian economics.
Amazing that, in one sense, like sometimes when I'm speaking to a lay crowd, I'll, on these types of issues and say, maybe, you could argue the US had to fight in World War II, for various moral and strategic and blah reason, but in general, just making a bunch of stuff to go get blown up and having a bunch of your able-bodied men go get killed is not good for the economy. Just as a general, blowing stuff up and getting people killed and workers killed. That doesn't help your economy per se. Like maybe it's in service to other things, but it's costly to be in a major war, even if you win. So, okay, well, I think that's a good place to end. So, folks, my guest has been Mark Koyama. Mark, thanks so much for your time and your insights.
Thanks, Bob. It's been great.
And thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
This concludes another episode of InFi, the Future of Finance, with Dr. Robert Murphy. The information provided is for educational purposes and does not constitute financial advice. Consult with qualified professionals before making any financial or investment decisions. For more information on the host and for previous episodes, visit InFi, thefutureoffinance.io. Thanks for listening.